Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
It was neither peace nor war, with constant communist probing and Western countermeasures, a worldwide struggle of pathological hostility as each side saw the other as the incarnation of evil. The Cold War, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
The year 1945 was the end of a period and also of a way of life. The Second World War had shaken the globe like a great earthquake, and nothing after it was going to be the same again. The age of European dominance was over. The supremacy of European countries, based as much on prestige as on power, could not survive the blow it had received. But the great European colonial empires had already been sapped in earlier years by declining confidence among the masters and ever more strident appeals to the liberal doctrines that the masters taught. Now these empires quickly fell to pieces when the economic and military power that had won them, that had held them, disappeared. The sun, when it sets, goes quietly. The confidence that made Europeans shoulder the white man's burden uninvited broke down. The war had shown that the seats of power now lay outside Europe. They lay with Europe's two great offspring, the Soviet Union and the United States. And with these new centers of power, there came a new rivalry that has dominated the world ever since. The first international act after the war was to create a new organization, the United Nations, all 159 of them, to replace the League of Nations, discredited as an ineffective talking shop. The structure of the United Nations was designed to balance the interests of the great powers, which had won the war, against those of other weaker nations. The United Nations did not prove vastly more effective than its predecessor in avoiding conflicts. It, too, was a talking shop. But talking is better than fighting. The primary reason why the talk never degenerated into global war was the balance of terror. A new factor which we now regard or disregard as an old familiar factor. America, remember, had demonstrated the incredible power of the atom bomb in 1945. By 1949, the Soviets had a bomb of their own, in spite of a prediction by US Army intelligence that they wouldn't be able to build one for a whole generation. Within a few years, both the United States and Russia had hydrogen bombs as well, vastly more powerful and more deadly than the old atom bombs. And by 1957, the Soviets could also put a satellite into orbit, the implications of which were not lost on the West. An intercontinental ballistic missile that could carry Sputnik could also carry atomic warheads to the United States and to Western Europe. Paradoxically, this threat of mutually assured destruction, as it was eventually known, this threat made a lot of people very nervous and forced the atomic nations to use their power with relative caution. The risk of an atomic blow-up did not prevent other conflicts, but it did keep them within limits. And as a result, the years since 1945 were full of crises and of conflict, but none of these has yet degenerated into the sort of general war that devastated Europe and much of the rest of the world in the two world wars. If it does, we probably won't be here to talk about it. But in the last year of World War II, it wasn't at all clear how things were going to turn out. There was reason to fear that the Soviets under Stalin would press their conquests forward into Central and Western Europe and down to the Mediterranean. An enfeebled Europe looked like easy prey. In fact, though, Russia's conquests during 1945 stopped on her eastern borderlands, where she annexed the Baltic states, large chunks of Germany and Poland, and where she set up a string of vassal states from Poland to the Balkans. Germany itself, divided and occupied after 1945, furnished one of these vassal states in its eastern portion, while the Allied zone of occupation in the west became a democratic federal republic in due course. The way Europe was divided after the war reproduced patterns that had been set 1,000 years before. If you look at the map, you can see how much non-communist Europe has in common with the Roman Empire and the Carolingian Empire, and how largely the communist empire, especially where it runs through Germany, coincides with the areas that Western Christianity and the Western tradition left untouched for a long time. After the war, Germany became a main stage for Russian probes and Western resistance, especially in Berlin. Although the city had been divided among the victors after the war like the rest of Germany, Berlin was located 100 miles within Russia's occupied German zone. This marked the city as a permanent sore and one the communists could scratch whenever they wanted. The Berlin airlift of 1948 and 49 came about when the Russians closed land access to the city, hoping to force the French, British, and Americans out. It didn't work. Supplies were brought in by plane, tens of thousands of flights, but the crisis was not the first, nor the last, there and elsewhere. Berlin was only one point where the friction turned to crisis, where constant communist probing forced Western countermeasures. It was an entirely new situation, neither peace nor war, but a worldwide struggle in which every possible weapon was used short of the direct confrontation that might lead to atomic warfare. In a speech in 1947, Bernard Baruch, the American financier, gave it a name, the Cold War. In the 19th century, the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville had seen the future of the world divided between Americans and Russians, one side standing for liberty, the other for servitude. Now, the almost pathological hostility between the two camps rose to more fantastic heights than when the Bolsheviks had seized power in 1917. Within a few years, each side had learned to look upon the other as the incarnation of evil. But even this unpleasant situation wasn't entirely useless, as we shall see. After 1945, the impoverished remnants of West European power could not maintain a Cold War on their own. That was something only the Americans could do, and they started to do so in 1947 to help Greece and Turkey, then under heavy pressure from the communists.
I present to you at this time.
On March 12th of that year, President Truman went before Congress to ask for aid and to enunciate what came to be called the Truman Doctrine.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
Whether you think the Truman Doctrine is noble or foolhardy or something in between, it has colored American foreign policy ever since, from Greece to Vietnam to Nicaragua. But back in 1948, it could not prevent a communist coup in Czechoslovakia, the last country in Eastern Europe to have preserved its independence. The rape of Czechoslovakia, a fragile democracy violated twice in a decade, first by Hitler, then by Stalin, this followed quickly by the blockade of Berlin, made 1948 a very uneasy year. So, as a first step in their own defense, Britain, France, and the Benelux countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, signed a defensive treaty out of which NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was to grow. Ironically, the great power clash which had been expected and feared in Europe broke out at the other end of the world when the Russian-trained troops of North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950. Korea was another country divided between communist and Allied occupation zones. And the war the United Nations fought there, the war to keep Korea divided, rather than let the northern communists take the lot, lasted 3 years. It brought in the Chinese. It saw General Douglas MacArthur advocating the invasion of China and possibly the start of World War III, until Truman brought him home. The war cost some 3 million casualties among the military and civilian populations involved, including about 140,000 Americans. In Europe, one effect of the Korean War was the feeling that NATO could only work properly if Germany was armed and integrated into the military alliance of the democracies that had beaten her. So by 1955, Germany had become a full-fledged member of the treaty organization only 10 years after her defeat. But this military build-up was not the only tactic the West used. It was apparent that the communists did best where economic and social dislocation on a major scale wore down the middle class and made workers miserable, creating social grievances that the communists could use. The anti-communists, therefore, had to make war on poverty, unemployment, hunger, and inflation. In June 1947, the U.S. Secretary of State, General George C. Marshall, announced a new policy directed, he said, not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy.
It menaces no one.
Well, it doesn't always happen, but the Marshall Plan worked as planned. The actual financial aid that it provided, equivalent to about $60 billion in 1987 terms, was somewhat less than the American aid which Europe had received from 1945 to the time it started. But previous aid had been distributed haphazardly. This new aid was going to be coordinated by Europeans themselves. Indeed, the greatest function of the Marshall Plan was to promote European cooperation in the establishment of a common recovery program, which by 1951 brought industrial output back to pre-war levels. With a series of international agreements, Western Europe tried to leave behind the conflicts of national claims and ambitions which had shaped it and scarred it over the past century and a half. And it moved towards political and economic integration managed by supranational institutions. It's unlikely that this would have happened without the original American initiative. Or, one would think, without the stubborn policy of Stalin, who was determined to keep his part of Europe out of it. And so the advance of West European integration and the advance of communist policy developed in a kind of counterpoint. The Marshall Plan was a counter to communist advances. And the answer to this Western aid was a tightening of Stalinist reins on Eastern satellites, culminating in the loss of Czech independence in 1948. The struggle over Berlin in that same year encouraged the creation of NATO, and the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 hastened the emancipation of West Germany, whose manpower and resources could not be spared, which in turn led to the sovereignty of the rival German Democratic Republic in the East and to the creation of the Warsaw Pact to reinforce Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, the German resurgence prompted the pooling of coal and steel resources of Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, France, and Germany in the European coal and steel community in order to restrain and control German economic activity. And that led to the creation of the European Economic Community in 1957, which established a common market in Western Europe with common tariffs, ensuring the free movement of capital, labor, and goods, and working out common social and economic policies. You know that it's a classic rule that unification provides a vaster market and broader opportunities, not only for trade, but for planning on a more economical scale. By 1960, even though European economic unification was still grudging, incomplete, hesitant, the consumption, productivity, and living standards of people living in Western Europe were double what they had been before the war. Western Europe had 3% of the land and 10% of the population of the world, but it had 20% of its food, 25% of its total output, 40% of world trade. By 1973, the average European consumed more than twice as much as he had done in 1950. Some denounced this as crass consumerism. Most regarded it as a distinct improvement. A lot more people had proper homes to live in, refrigerators, even cars. They lived better, they ate better, and as a result, the generations that grew up in the 50s and 60s were a good deal taller than their parents. One thing this meant was that very few people remained who had nothing to lose, as their parents had had nothing to lose in the Depression. They now had a stake in society. They wanted to see it continue changing for the better. And they didn't want to change it radically, let alone destroy it, or see it destroyed. But while this European miracle was the doing of Europeans, with a little help from their friends, the preservation of the miracle in the West continued to be regarded as somebody else's business. Just as in the 1930s, the European democracies did not want to make the effort, did not want to spend the money or to draft their young people to ensure their own defense. And this is not very surprising. Sensible people, free people, prefer to invest in present needs and comforts rather than in hypothetical future threats. For the economy, this attitude is very practical. The United States built up its economy in the 19th century with hardly an army and not much of a navy, which left a lot more resources for productive investment. And West Germany and Japan have now joined the United States as the world's greatest economic powers because they spend so little on defense. So this is the reasonable way to act. But it's only the reasonable way if you have somebody who will shoulder the burden for you and keep you safe. And in the second half of the 20th century, that someone is the United States. So the defense of Western Europe was left in large part to the Americans. And since most Europeans weren't going to provide sufficient men and money to safeguard themselves, the deterrent was provided by atomic weaponry. Inferiority in conventional forces was compensated by atomic defense. In effect, NATO was saying to the Soviets and to Eastern Europe, if you attack us with infantry and tanks and planes, we shall be forced to use our atom bombs. This has worked well enough, except that a lot of people in Europe now feel caught between the two superpowers, and they seem to have forgotten the history of nuclear deterrence, the fact that nuclear weapons were far cheaper in the first place than the conventional forces that no one in the West wanted to pay for. Meanwhile, the Cold War was redefining the meaning of the West as that part of the world where Soviet writ did not run. So the West, meaning us, included Turkey but not Czechoslovakia, Israel but not Hungary, Japan but not Cuba. The political systems of these so-called Western nations vary widely, of course, but in all of them the capitalist system was being steadily modified to include elements of socialism and social welfare programs, forms of economic organization more traditionally associated with their communist rivals. And while the Western world moved ever further away from the capitalist model that Marx and Lenin described, the Soviet world moved closer to the kind of old regime it claimed to replace, complete with police control, intellectual control, militarism, and nationalism. And so the combination of nationalism and socialism, albeit in very different forms, this combination has been reincarnated in communist regimes and to some extent in capitalist regimes just a few decades after the defeat of Germany. But the places where it has flourished most are in the so-called Third World. It's never been clear to me where the Second World is situated, but let's say so. In the countries that have sprung up on the ruins of the West's old colonies, nationalism and socialism combine. And we'll take a look at these countries and their European legacy in our next program. Until then.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.